constantly trying to find answers to bring modernization to its people. And this time, during the opening session of the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, President Xi delivered the report, which is much anticipated by the world, where he talked about a Chinese path of modernization. I'm sure you have taken note of that, because it's a very first time that he put specific emphasis on the Chinese path of modernization. He was talking about this is a modernization of a huge population. This is a modernization of a harmony between nature and humanity. This is modernization of a peaceful development, and so on and so forth. What do you think of this sets of elaborations, and do you think these are important to be heard for people in developing countries?
Yes, exactly, and it speaks to my latest book. It speaks to my latest book because we first had China Dream, and then we had everything with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
I said, what is Chinese characteristics? After so many travels to China and back and staying in Zhejiang and Beijing, I discovered what is Chinese characteristics. Chinese characteristics is a model that will serve local Chinese people. And if those models are successful, then they can help Chinese people to go outside. But at the core of those Chinese characteristics, it is Chinese value system. What happened in China? China was able to subdue modernity to its traditions. For example, the family hierarchy in China, the rationale is spread through all other institutions, be it government, be it school, be it work units. That structure, family structure of respect, exists. So that is Chinese characteristics. Chinese characteristics is to drink from Chinese traditions in order to tackle modernity. Not take modernity for modernity's sake and let it to be a runaway train, because then you lose Chinese identity. And that is the balance that even Africa has to find. Yes, we want to be modern, but what is it that speaks to our mind and our hearts? And I think that's another role, duty for China to understand. What is it that is in the African mind and African heart that is a foundational value of Africa? Then China will succeed to have a long-term cooperation with Africa.
What does it mean for China to highlight such a model, to highlight the Chineseness of our modernization? What does it mean for the Western world, Dr. Tembe?
Let me start from the good aspect. What does it mean for the African world? It means there is a chance for Africa to develop without feeling inferior. There is a chance for Africa to create a model based on its original traditions, be they pre-colonial, be those of the liberation movements. So there is a big light. That's one of the things that draws me to China. Having stayed in Northern Europe for almost 15 years, when I moved to China, I found similarities. I found as if I was home, but a better home in the sense that traditions did not only end in the private household, they stretched out. So the rationale of tradition was in the corridors of power and in the workplace. Now, coming to what does it mean to the Western world? Of course, when there's a new kid in the block, you are going to feel threatened. And we've had a couple of schisms between West and China. We've seen the current rise of unilateralism. And that unilateralism is based on the fact that if there's a fair play, then China, quote unquote, will take over, which is not true. So there is some sort of either resentment or the West feeling threatened to a certain level that, look, this is a paradigm shift now. And that is what I expound in my current work of which I call fear of equality, instilling meritocracy.
Fear of equality.
Equality. And China strives for equality.
Right.
the biggest work of the CPC with President Xi Jinping at the helm, the main issue is to get rid of disparities between the poor and the rich. Last year, we were speaking of a relatively prosperous society. And those are new concepts. This is the biggest paradigm shift. If more parts of the world could learn from that and move away from the situation of the zero-sum game, we'll be having another world very soon.
Yeah.
Or our children will be having another world.
Some people naturally, I would say, would be concerned that why is China so obsessed about its uniqueness? You know, why is China not able to integrate itself into the common path of modernization? Why does it have to stress, look, the Chinese characteristics, Chinese traditions, Chinese identity? Do you see it that way? Is there the danger of an over-obsession with holding on to one's identity and past?
There is a book written by Professor Arif Dirlik. He says, whose modernization is it anyway? Whose modernization? Because the history of 500 years until now has been a history of deleting and rubbing away all other modernizations, as if history only happened in one region of the world, which is the West. And that is a fallacy. And that fallacy and that mentality is still affecting China-Africa relations. Until very recently, Africans knew about China through Western rhetoric. And what I call sinologism, and Professor Cho called sinologism, is when Chinese try to understand, even my scholar colleagues from China, try to understand Africa via the Western perspective. And it is now our duty through projects like this that you must get a synergy whereby when I look at a Chinese person, I first look at a Chinese identity, not the false level of hierarchy, white, Asian, African. There is this fallacy of hierarchies in the world, and that fallacy translates into economic violence, translates into social violence, and it translates to right out superiority. And that hubris, when you see another region which is not Western developing to the international sphere, then you start getting scared. This is why we find unilateralism pushing so high. And that's exactly why China is pushing so much. And I think it will come up in the current Congress, pushing for multilateralism, because unilateralism is not going to lead us anywhere. The obsession is fallacy.
The obsession is
just
fallacy,
fear.
Not our past,
Yeah,
not our identity.
Yes.
We should be able to feel proud of what we have always been and continue to be who we are.
Exactly.
So what does that mean for the rest of the world, let's say, in 5 years? Will we see some tangible changes to the international order as a result of that, as a result of a more assertive Chinese identity? We are finally able to say and to be proud of who we are as Chinese and Africans as well.
Yes, as Africans as well. That's what I was going to move into, because China has taken a risk here. China has done lots of things that have not been done, that have not been achieved in human history. Getting rid of poverty, 770 million, giving people sound schools, and keep on advancing. China even went to the extent or to spheres where nobody thought, because everybody looked at the trajectory of development at step by step. Mm-hmm. But China refused to do that. For example, you've got satellite in space, and you are fighting, and now we are competing about payloads with the master of space, if I can call them so. That is both Russia and the United States of America. China is there in the midst. That tells me then that if Africa can put its ducks in order in 20 years' time or so, because we have a couple of advantages. Mineral resources. We are looking at the African demographic dividend, arable land. Mostly, which should not be undermined if used correctly. we have China as our partner. China is the greatest trader with Africa. China is the second biggest economy in the world. So Africa also aspires to that position. Without copy and paste from Chinese system, we will look where China has succeeded and how China has succeeded. And I've already mentioned two. One, implementation. And implementation is only feasible if we have a long-term strategy. That's number one. Number two, get rid of colonial perspectives or Western perspective of regarding the selves. Africa has to look at itself with its own values and then take all modernities, both Asian and European modernities, and put it under its tradition. You cannot change yourself from being a frog to be a snake just because snakes eat better, or you think snakes have a better life. You've been born a frog, we're a frog, find a way. And China has showed us that. Maybe the analogy, I know traditionally we've got different meanings about animals, but I think you understand my analogy.
We will be ourselves.
A tiger is a tiger.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Let's be ourselves.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what Africa needs.
Absolutely. Dr. Paul Tembe joining us from Pretoria at the University of South Africa. Such a pleasure to have had this conversation with you. My interview with Dr. Paul Tembe, Senior Researcher and Lecturer at the University of South Africa. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, former Prime Minister of Greece, George Papandreou, speaks on the causes of the world crisis through eyes of Europe. Stay with us.